Now, if you don't know me, you don't know this about me. If you do know me, you know this about me. I spent a number of years in the corporate world. And I used to commute from Napa to San Ramon. And if you've ever been down there, you know that's not an easy commute. You have to go over 2 bridges. And the commute home on Friday, well, that was even worse. That was really nuts. And one time I was coming home and I was just coming into town and I was at the corner of Highway 29 and Imola, and if you know where that is, you'll know what I'm talking about. Because immediately on the right is Napa State Hospital for the criminally insane. And of course it's right at that time that my tire decided to get a flat. So I had to pull in and I made it right and I parked in front of the fence and I got out of the car because I needed to change the flat. And there was this guy standing behind that fence. And that fence was, 10, 12 feet high, and it had a lot of barbed wire on, so I thought I was safe. But this guy behind the fence was creepy. He had these eyes that just stared at you. It's like, oh, really scared, really, really hard to feel safe. So I ignored him. I didn't know what else to do. And I opened up the trunk, and I got the spare tire out and the lug nut, the lug wrench, and the jack, and I jacked it up a little bit. I took the hubcap off. Everybody know what a hubcap is, the younger generation? We had hubcaps back then. And I did what I was supposed to do, what my dad taught me to do, which is raise up the car a little bit, loosen up those lug nuts, bring it back up, take them all the way off, take the spare off. I was doing all that. Took the lug nuts off and threw them in the hubcap like my dad told me to do, reached over with the flat, put it over here, reached over to get the spare, and I kicked the hubcap. And every one of those 6 lug nuts went down into the sewer. Now, I was a new Christian way back then, and I hadn't read in the Bible where we're not allowed to use choice words. And I was using choice words. And the guy on the other side of the fence was just staring at me. Staring, scary-like. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and more choice words came out of my mouth, now under my breath, because I didn't want him to engage with me. Then he said, "Hey, you." I ignored him. Again, I didn't want to engage. I didn't know what he was going to say or what he was going to do, if he was going to throw something through the holes in the fence, try to climb it. I was just scared. He was creepy. So I ignored him. He said, "Hey, you," again, and I ignored him. And then he said, "Hey, you with the flat tire." Couldn't ignore him. And he said, "Why don't you just take 1 lug nut off the other 3 tires and get your tire back on with the 3, and then you can go to an automotive store and buy the remainder." Wow. And I looked at him and I said, "Just, wow, how did you ever come up with that? I mean, that's really amazing." And he looked at me and he said, "Look, I'm crazy, not stupid." And this story, oh so not true, is how many see us Christians. People think we're stupid, we're illogical, we're crazy if we have a relationship with God, if we're in love with God, if we're crazy about God. And they suggest that having faith in God, a God that we can't see, touch, hear, or smell, means we're either brainless or insane. They think we're dim-witted if we trust the Bible as the inspired word of God as merely something written by men that has good stories in it. Now, I believe, so I must be stupid. No comments from the worship team. And I've been told that I'm using God as a crutch. Using God as a crutch. But I think we all need crutches. I think we all need help to get through this crazy, complicated life. And you'd be insane not to want the help of an all-knowing, all-powerful, ever-present God. You see, what I've discovered is that life is better with God than without God. Amen? If he exists. And that's been our battle, isn't it? If he exists. So the question is, does he exist? And if he exists, is he active and participatory in his creation? Because some believe that there's this God, they're theists, or rather deists, that God created the universe and then left us alone, left us up to our own devices. So the next question is, if there is a God, is he active and participatory in his creation? And if so, why did God set it up for our relationship to depend upon faith? Why do we have to have faith to have a relationship with God? Now, faith is defined in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain for what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So, believing don't require no seeing. I mean, who believes in what they read in the newspapers these days? I don't. But we believe in God because God reveals himself to us as we seek him. He reveals himself to us, which means we don't always have to rely on blind faith to believe. And this morning we're going to delve into one of God's miracles, the miracle at Jericho as described in Joshua chapter 6. And this miracle is reinforced by the rich circumstantial evidence provided by archaeological studies. And these archaeological studies prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this miracle really did happen. And I think in this case, seeing can surely help believing. You know, circumstantial evidence is proven facts by which other facts can be derived. It's used in our legal system to demonstrate credibility and or guilt or innocence. For example, if your fingerprints are at the scene of the crime, that's circumstantial evidence and it's enough to prove you guilty. If you come home to find all the Haagen-Dazs chocolate chip ice cream gone, and your kid with a brown, smudged, and guilty look on his face, well, you know who the culprit is. And all of that is circumstantial evidence. Now, given the circumstantial evidence, even the Encyclopedia Britannica and the UN's Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which is called UNESCO, couldn't deny that Tel El-Sidon, or Es-Sidon, is the Old Testament Jericho. By the way, Tel is an ancient mound. And usually archaeologists dig at the tells to uncover what was underneath it. And the UN not only recognized that this was Jericho, but they named it, ready for this, a World Heritage Site. And that was just last year, in 2023. And that's because the abundant circumstantial evidence perfectly matches up with the Old Testament story, as we'll see. But before we dig in, I'd like to give you some biblical backgrounds, just to review some biblical backgrounds. Joshua was born a slave 3,400 years ago and was part of the Hebrew Exodus that James thinks Charlton Heston led out of Egypt. It's actually Moses. By the way, who knows the Exodus story from the Bible? Who knows it from the movie? Now, Joshua witnessed the plagues, all 10 of them. He went through the Passover. He saw the parting of the Red Sea, and he climbed Mount Sinai with Moses to receive the 10 Commandments. Joshua, along with his sidekick Caleb, trusted the Lord and called for Israel to enter the Promised Land. Joshua and Caleb, aren't they popular names even through today? How many Calebs do you know? How many Joshuas? And that's because these two men, well, they trusted and obeyed God. They were good men. Now, if we look back, it seems like a no-brainer to trust God with everything that they saw. But they didn't. They didn't. They did not trust God with all the miracles they saw. And Joshua and his compadres experienced these things firsthand. But they didn't. Most of them did not believe. You would think that there'd be no braining here going on. But a plethora of Israelites were disobedient and refused to go in and take possession of their inheritance. So Joshua and many, many others were collateral damage to the disobedience, to their disobedience. And they wandered in the desert for 40 years before it. They had 40 laps to take, like the cartoon, but each lap took a year. And even though Joshua was obedient, he still ended up stuck in the desert for 40 years with those defiant ones, eating manna and quail that God supplied while following a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. You can read all about that in the book of Exodus, and I pray you will. But listen, Joshua trusted God. He obeyed God, and the Lord made him Moses' successor to lead the Israeli conquest of the promised land that was flowing with milk and honey. And listen again to what God said to Joshua about obeying in Joshua chapter 1, verse 7. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you will be successful in everything you do. Joshua was obedient. Joshua was faithful. He served the Lord and so enjoyed great victories, beginning with the city of Jericho. And up on the screen, you're seeing now Tel Jericho, Tel El Sidon. The city itself was tiny. You could walk around it in 20 minutes. It's like taking a walk around Walmart or a 3/4 mile walk around the block. It was small. And it was situated on a major trade route 20 miles east of Jerusalem, with thousands living within its walls and the surrounding areas. So, why would God order the destruction, the obliteration of this oldest known city? Why would he do that? And that's because, as one commentator mentions, they were, the people inside the walls and outside the walls, incorrigible idolaters, addicted to the most horrible vices. Led by their tyrannical and vile god kings, the population practiced repugnant and immoral rituals, including child sacrifices and sexual perversions. They were like Sodom and Gomorrah, and their deep depravity and wickedness led to their ruin. Now, an illustrated children's Bible says, when we do what God says, big things happen. When we do what God says, big things happen. In other words, when we choose to listen and obey a real big God, real big things happen. Just as we've seen in chapters 1 through 5 that James has been preaching on. And as we're going to see in chapter 6. And again, let me just urge you to read all of it. Read your Bibles. I'm going to jump back just for a moment to where Joshua sent 2 spies to check out Jericho. And this will lead us into chapter 6. And as James mentioned a few weeks back, the Canaanite king discovered the scouts and sent soldiers to arrest them. But Rahab, an ancestress to Jesus, by the way, exchanged safety for her and her family for the rescue and escape of the two Jewish spies. Listen to Joshua chapter 2, verses 14 to 16. Our lives for your lives, the men assured Rahab. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So listen closely here. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She let them down by a rope through the window. That kind of means that it's kind of high up, right? I mean, we would jump 6 feet, but 10 feet, 20 feet, 28 feet, probably not. And she lived in that part of the city where the houses were in the wall. So we'll cover more of that later. But the bottom line is the spies escape, and that brings us to chapter 6, where God reveals the battle plan to conquer the city. So we're going to be in Joshua. We're going to start with verses 1 through 5 in chapter 6, and we'll be in the New International Version this morning. Now, Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the seventh day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every man straight in. Seriously? That's a battle plan? What kind of battle plan is that? Walk around the city for 7 days, give a shout, and boom, the walls fall down? And I could just hear the soldiers muttering in my head, maybe Joshua needs to head over to Napa State Hospital for a little downtime. It's crazy. It's crazy. But my point here is that God asks us to step out in trusting faith. To step out in trusting faith and do things outside of our comfort zone. Gosh, I've been doing it for 30 years, and I have found that God has been faithful each and every time. And often, God's plans don't make no sense. They don't make no sense. But that's where our faith is required. So, why march around the city? We know that God didn't need to announce a siege. He didn't need to psych out the inhabitants or boost the army's morale. No, methinks this was a symbolic announcement that God was isolating Jericho's evil, and the battle to take back a land possessed by spiritually corrupt people had begun. And I've read that the Lord was reestablishing his presence in Canaan and was fulfilling his promise to the Jewish people. Now, last week, James covered that Jesus, in a theophany or a Christophany, appeared to Joshua as an angel, confirming that God himself was in charge. Not Joshua, not the angel, but God himself. He was in charge. Now, common thought is that carrying the Ark of the Covenant signified that God was indeed the commander-in-chief, and it was showing everybody. And in chapter 6, verses 6 through 15, the commander-in-chief gave specific instructions to Joshua to share with everybody. And these are the instructions. The priests, the people, and the armed guard, the soldiers, were instructed to silently march around Jericho carrying the Ark of the Covenant while the trumpets sounded. I'm not sure if it was a jitterbug or not, but they were walking around. And they did this once a day for 6 days. But on the seventh day, they circled the city 7 times. And understand that 7 represents completeness in Jewish thought. We're going to pick up the next part of the story in verses 16 through 21. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, "Shout! For the Lord has given you the city." The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things. Keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury, not your own. And when the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in and took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, 100 years ago, this story was unprovable. It was unprovable. It was a fairy tale for Napa State Hospital candidates. That is, until archaeologists excavated the site of Tel Jericho. And the circumstantial evidence they unearthed is an undeniable confirmation of the biblical record, and to me, proof positive of God's existence. And I hope to you as well. Unless you can deny the undeniable. unless you can deny the undeniable. And there are those of us who do. From 1930 through 1936, after working to tell archaeologist Dr. John Garstang wrote an eyewitness declaration signed by himself and 2 other team members, and this is what it read. There remains no doubt. I repeat that. There remains no doubt. The walls fell outwards so completely that the attackers would be able to clamber up and over into the ruins. Now, logically, attacking soldiers would use siege works to get up to the top of the walls, and they would push the wall and the rocks and the stones and the bricks inward. They're not going to pull it out on themselves, are they? And in all other Middle Eastern archaeological digs, the city walls were pushed inward by the invading armies. And you can't clamber up those from the inside when you're on the outside. But when God is in charge, he can push those walls any which way he chooses. Now, some claim that the earthquake leveled the walls. We're always looking for ways out of having a miracle or trusting God, aren't we? But an earthquake happening at precisely the right moment, causing all the walls along the perimeter to fall outward, and in such a way as to preserve Rahab's house, as we'll soon see, and allow her rescue, as we'll soon read, can only point to one thing. Only one thing, that God caused this to happen. Period. This is Joshua 6:22 through 27. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her." So the young man who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and her mother and her brothers and all who belonged to her. They brought out the entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Listen, no matter what agency God used to bring about his will, it was ultimately he who brought those walls down. On to verses 24 through 27. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. They burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. That tells me that whoever was writing this, which is probably Joshua, was an eyewitness to this. Verse 26. At that time, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath. Cursed before the Lord is the man who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son will he lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest will he set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. God's no codependent. He allows us to suffer the consequences of our behavior. But it's tough for us who are filled with love for humankind to hear these type of things. But God knows what he's doing. And he's got our best interest at heart all the time. Back to archaeology. The archaeologists unearthed one wall that remained standing. Actually, it was 2 walls about 28 feet high is what they think, and they were linked together by houses built across the top. This also confirms the biblical record about houses being part of the city wall. This is circumstantial evidence that what happened really happened. And since the spies went to Rahab's house after they took the city, the wall supporting her house must have been spared. Therefore, Rahab's house must have been located in that wall, which was on the north side of the city, and that's where the archaeologists found it. And the only surviving and intact city wall. And again, this is circumstantial evidence, proof that the narrative really happened. And amazingly enough, unearthed in the excavation were large jars of charred grain in the destroyed buildings. And listen, this is a rare find. They never find grain because it was so valuable. It would have been used to feed the soldiers, the attackers. So why was it left? Well, in verses 18 through 20, God's specific instructions was for no one to plunder anything. None of it was to be plundered. None of it was to be taken. All of it was to be dedicated to the Lord, like the grain. And the Jewish army was faithful, mostly. Now, further confirmation of the burning of the city was attested to by Dr. Garstang, who noted a layer of ash 3 inches thick with burned timbers and debris. And archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, who dug at Jericho from 1950 to 1956, wrote this in her excavation report. The destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt. Again, doesn't this match up with the biblical record, what we read in the book of Joshua, chapter 6? And in 1956, and listen to this is a Yale professor back in the 50s when, well, professors could be trusted. The professor, Dr. Miller Burrows, studied the evidence and noted the excessive skepticism of many liberal theologians stemmed not from careful evaluation of the available data, but from an enormous predisposition against the supernatural, denying the undeniable. Going on, he wrote, on the whole, however, archaeological work has unquestionably strengthened confidence in the reliability of the scriptural record. In other words, Miller Burrows, the professor, was saying that the only way anyone can argue against the evidence is to be firmly closed-minded to the possibility of the supernatural, to the existence to God and therefore to his miracles, to deny the undeniable. How often do we want to deny the undeniable? Lord, please give me a close parking place to the front of the store. And there it is, the only one. Oh, that was just a coinky-dink, right? But it happens too often. And I have to thank the Lord for being so giving on such a mundane thing. Okay, with this said, I hope that we can all agree that there is enough circumstantial evidence in just this archaeological discovery to prove that the biblical account is true, that the miracle did happen, and therefore miracles do happen. It's only logical. And it's only logical to believe that there is a real and living God who exists. And again, by the way, this is only one of many biblical stories that are verified by the archaeological record. So the only logical conclusion we can reach about the walls of Jericho is it's true. What happened is true. And that God interceded. He did. If there's proof that God intervened, well, we must conclude he must exist. If he interceded into his creation, then he has to be active and participatory in his creation. The belief that an active God exists is based upon our facts from circumstantial evidence that really can't be argued. And if he was doing stuff back then, I guarantee you he's doing stuff right now. And the truth of an active God means we can be in a relationship with him. We can be in a relationship with him, and he will participate in our lives. And listen, please, given this, the narrative of Jericho holds an even greater truth for us. And that truth is, we are not left alone to our own human devices. Often we choose to rely our human devices instead of turning to God, but we are not left to our own human devices if we seek the Lord. So, ladies and gentlemen, what's your verdict? What's your verdict? If we listen and obey, will things go better because we know that the battles of a complicated life and the struggles in a believer's life are won by God? Yea or nay? If we listen to and obey God, will big things in our lives happen? Are you convicted of that? Are you convicted that while He's in control of the timing, and it's not always our timing, but in His timing, those impenetrable walls of life's problems are easier to conquer when we're waging battle with God in His way, not our own. He is the commander-in-chief. And look, I know it's easier for some of us to say to each other, "Oh, God's got this. I'm struggling. God's got this." I don't want to hear that, especially when you can't possibly know what I am going through. You don't know what I'm going through. How can you say that God's got this? Look, all of us, we have our own struggles. We have our own battles. We all suffer, even if some of us hide it a whole bunch better. I'm fine, thank you very much. While inside, I am a mess. But when we listen and follow what God tells us to do, and then do it, when we're obedient and do the things He tells us to do, well, things will get better. And big things will happen in your life in the long run. Not as quick as we want, but I, at this age, look back and I see all the big, big things that have happened. We never saw them in the moment. And listen, I also know that there's an active and participatory God because I've heard His voice in my inner ear. And I am not crazy. I have heard His voice. I know it was His voice because silly things, He only uses monosyllables, and I like using 5-syllable words. But He uses 3 or 4 words, monosyllable, and they are the perfect response and give the perfect answer to whatever I am faced with. And that has happened 6 or 7 times. And the answer was always perfect because I was listening and seeking God. So yes, God cares enough, loves me enough to talk directly to me. And He loves you enough to talk directly to you if you'll listen. God will speak to you. He'll speak to you in His Word, the Bible. He'll speak to you through other people or through circumstances and events. Again, if we listen. He'll speak in your head sometimes or in your dreams if we listen. The Israelites followed God's instructions, even though it seemed crazy and stupid. I'm sure it was way beyond their comfort zone. But the battle was won. The battle was won. And after a time of preparation, the Israelis showed up. They paid attention. They paid attention to God, and they trustingly did what God told them to do. They relied on God. They exclaimed the truth with a mighty shout in unison, and they trusted that God was in control. Will you? Do you trust that God is in control? Now, I also want to talk about the flip side of being disobedient for a moment. What happens when we disobey God? When my little plans and designs don't align with the Lord's? When my schemes outweigh the Lord's agenda and get in His way? When we lose the battle of I, and I clash with His instructions? You know what happens? Trouble with a capital T. And that's been my experience. Now, next week, James is going to cover the next wicked city on the hit list in chapter 7, and that's the tiny town of Ai. The tiny town of Ai. The Hebrew warriors were soundly thrashed by this tiny, tiny little town. It came as a complete shock to them after the great victory at Jericho. And I'm sure that whatever was going on in their hearts, they were aching over this defeat. Joshua prayed to the Lord for understanding, and God, faithful as always, revealed the reason for their whooping. A guy named Achan ignored. He ignored what God told him to do. He didn't do what the Lord said to do. He disobeyed. Now look, actually, the name of the city isn't always pronounced I. It's A-E for most people. A-E. And Achan is actually named Achan. Achan. Just like it's spelled up there. Okay, I'm going to try to get back to that slide. Right there. Sean's short. She can't see over the top, so she didn't see me pushing the slide back. So Achan and A-E. The battle of Ai causes Achan in my heart. Don't let the battle of Ai get in your way with your relationship with God. Don't let the battle of Ai prevent your victory over life's complications. Okay, now we're going to finish up. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, verses 30 and 31. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell, after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she, in obedience, welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. So when we, by faith, follow God's directions, insane as it may be, big things, good things will happen. And here's the point, the primary lesson, the main point. We're not crazy or stupid to trust God. We're not crazy or stupid or nuts to be in a relationship with him. God is indeed present and true to his promises if we're faithful and obedient like Joshua was. But when we're disobedient like Achan, when we sin and hurt our fellowship with God, we hurt those around us. So we all pay that price. It's not just us when we sin that pay a price, it's all of us. And sometimes in the short run, like Achan, as we'll see next week, he'll pay a big price. Bottom line, sin messes everything up. But listen, 1,400 years later, 1,400 years after Jericho, God took care of that problem. He sent his son Jesus to pay the price for our sins and our wrongdoings, our disobedience. And if we have a truly repentant heart that turns towards him, then by his grace we avoid the eternal price and the here and now price of disobedience. Because we all sin, we all fall short, as James likes to say, every day. He does it 7 times a day, I only do it once. Just want you to know that. And even when we fail and we fall, and we will, Jesus paid the price for that. He paid our price of admission into the eternity in heaven, our salvation. And the tickets are easy to get, because he wants to be in our lives. He wants to be in a relationship with us. He doesn't want us hurting. He doesn't want us aching, at least without cause. And if you've never thought of having God in your life, and some of us haven't, or if you have had God in your life and you wandered away, or you believe you have God in your life, but you don't have that kind of a relationship, understand that God is always waiting. His hand is out waiting for you. I'd like to share one last story as the worship team comes back up. I was probably 3, maybe 4. I'm not really sure, but I know that I went to Safeway on Staten Island with my dad, and we were in the vegetable department. And I was standing next to him, and I was staring at something. I don't know what it was because it's too long ago. It was way before I even knew about hubcaps. And I reached up to take his hand. And I felt it jerk, and I looked up, and it wasn't my dad. And the guy's looking at me like, what are you doing? And I was really scared. I was really, really scared. I don't know where my dad went, right? I mean, I stopped paying attention to him. I stopped paying attention to where my dad was. I stopped. And all of a sudden, there was somebody else in his place. And I can't, I don't know what damage was done to me psychologically that day. But I looked around for him just scared, and I saw him, and I ran, and I took his hand. You know what he did? He took my hand. And that's our God. If we've wandered away, he's over there just waiting. His hand is out. And I'd like to give those of you who have not accepted Jesus as the Lord of your life and your King, the Lord of your life and your Savior for all eternity, an opportunity to do so. It's just a short, easy prayer because he wants us to be in a relationship with him. So I'm going to ask everybody to close your eyes, bow your heads. Pray this along with me. If you do not know Jesus, pray it with me. If you do know Jesus and you know what it's like on this side of that relationship, would you please be praying for others?